What is the FAA doing with medical certificates during the COVID-19 crisis? We're going to find out coming up next. Well, hi everyone, Carl Valeri with the Stuck Mic Avcast, and this is a special video production. We're going to discuss what the FAA is doing for medical certificates during this COVID-19 crisis. Joining me today is Chris Pezalla. He's a pilot and attorney with the law offices of Robert Strumor. Hey, Chris, how's it going today?
Good, Carl. How are you doing?
I am doing wonderful, and thanks for joining us today to discuss what's happening with medical certification during this whole crisis, COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit about the situation, first of all, to set this up, and I'll tell you what's been happening with me and personally. People I work with and myself were going out of currency for landings. That's another issue. And then also, some of us can't get to the doctor. The doctor's closed, the FAA medical examiner, so we can't get our certification. And so that's been an issue. So that's basically what's happening. So, and I'm sure you're seeing that too, Chris. So tell us what's going on with the FAA and any examples you might have of some people that are having issues.
Well, yes, Carl. Actually, we're seeing the same issue. As you know, I fly full-time normally for an air carrier. The last couple of weeks have been pretty slow, so everybody's definitely double-checking their landings. I had to actually count mine up yesterday. As far as the landings go, of course, you know, if a pilot goes out of currency, they're going to have to go to either with an instructor if they're general aviation, or they're going to go to a simulator, most likely, to get current again. Now, in the GA world, of course, you can fly solo without the 90-day currency, but I don't recommend that as an experienced flight instructor. I know I've taken a few months off myself, and I get rusty in a pretty big hurry. And now the other topic, of course, is the medical certification. And this is a little bit harder to deal with. A lot of things are closed. A lot of medical examiners are not doing as many exams as they normally do. They may not be doing any. So the FAA has taken note of that concern. And what they've said is that they are going to allow a one-time exemption to their enforcement policies.
So this one-time exemption that we're talking about, this is definitely not, it's not a new regulation, it's not a new law, correct?
That's correct. To change the laws or to change the regulations would be very time-consuming. This COVID-19 crisis is moving far too quickly. So what the FAA has said is that they're going to have a policy of non-enforcement. In other words, flying with a medical that is no longer within the valid period would still be technically a violation. However, they're not going to take any actions. They're not going to take any enforcement action against a pilot who flies with an expired medical during this window. And so this window is going to be from March 31st to June 30th. So if you're flying in those periods of time with an expired medical, or one that's exceeded the time frame that's normally valid, the FAA is saying they're not going to take any legal action against you.
And repeat those dates one more time.
And so that range is March 31st through June 30th. So the pilots to be affected are pilots whose medicals would normally be renewed in the months of March, April, or May. So if you're anticipating renewal this year, March, April, or May, you've now got up till June 30th in order to fly. Now, if you get to June 31st, you've got two issues. One is that the policy is no longer in effect, and two, there is no June 31st.
I was like, wait a minute. I'm looking at my calendar saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that. But so we have two issues there, obviously. So June 30th is going to be the time when that expires. There are no enforcement. You know, one of the things that I have heard, and maybe you could speak towards this, is the fact that there are some specific like letters of agreement or arrangements with specific operators, say with airlines. We're not seeing that in the general aviation world, though, right?
As far as the extensions go, so that's a good question, because every operator has their own manuals. These manuals for 135 and 121, that's charter and air carrier, normally specify that a pilot would be within that allotted duration, in other words, the unexpired medical. And so the FAA's policy only applied to the pilots. It didn't initially apply to air carriers, but I believe most of the air carriers have consulted with the FAA and they feel comfortable proceeding with their pilots having the medicals exceeding their normal time frame.
Right, and that's what many of them are seeing, and that I know of. But I'm sure it's a case by case basis. But as far as us in our general aviation aircraft, can anybody, like you talked about this extension? Does that mean anybody can fly that has an old medical?
And that's not the case. Somebody mentioned that the other day and they said, well, my grandfather hasn't flown in 10 years. He can come back out again. And the answer is no. They very specifically said in their verbiage that the pilot must have an unexpired medical on March 31st. So if your medical was good on March 31st, which would be a March expiration or later, then you can continue to use it. But if you had, say, a medical that was due in February and you didn't do it, unfortunately, you've missed your opportunity. You do need to go back now and do the medical certification.
Right. So it's not kind of a get out of jail free kind of thing for forgetting to do your medical or whatever. But I understand. I mean, it makes perfect sense. But one of the concerns is a lot of folks nowadays, especially friends that are flight instructors, et cetera, are using basic med. So how does that affect basic med?
So this policy change only affects the regular pilot certifications, the first, second, and third class medicals. So if you're moving into basic med or you're on basic med, those procedures have not changed. So those rules are the same, and with those ones, you do need to comply with the normal time frames. Same thing with light sport. You do comply with the driver's license requirement. That's going to be an issue, especially with the driver's license. I know here in Florida, the DMV is not renewing a lot of driver's license right now, and that's a problem because to fly light sport, you need the unexpired driver's license. So that's going to be a gray area, but if I was light sport, I would make sure that I was still meeting all of the normal requirements.
Interesting. So, again, we're going back to all these, it's all intertwined. I mean, all these expirations, et cetera. The other part of this, too, is there's something else that happens with your medical. Say you're one of those individuals that has a special issuance, which a lot of people do. What's going to happen to those folks?
So I've got a few calls from the special issuance folks, and the FAA did not make any reference to that in their notice about the new policy. But the policy basically states that they will not enforce for people exceeding the durations. So I'm reading that will also include special issuance that would have expired on those same days. That being said, it is a gray area. So if a pilot special issuance get their medical renewed, I would still do it and not spend time in that gray area if less really necessary.
Okay, understand. Another thing that's important to us as pilots is having a current medical, because a lot of times we fly internationally, meaning, say Canada, Mexico, the Bahamas, that type of thing. And I know a lot of international flights are quote unquote possibly shut down. And I do know private flying has been happening to go down and pick up people and come back. So what do we do? Say we do have a medical that's expiring, but we want to fly internationally.
So the FAA was very clear that this non-enforcement policy only applies within the United States. It does not apply outside the United States. So operating a U.S. registered plane outside the U.S. with an expired medical can still be enforced by the FAA or by the local authorities. And I'll remind you, without a lot of air traffic right now, the local authorities in a lot of other countries have a lot of time on their hands. And in many of these places, these folks are worried about their jobs. And so they're going to be out there checking every plane they can check, in addition to checking for quarantine requirements. So as a U.S. pilot, you would not want to get stopped in another country with a paperwork issue. So if you're flying international, you're going to need to get that medical renewed, consistent with the usual policies.
Kind of like when we're driving, it seems like there's nobody else on the road. Not the time to speed, that's for sure. Not that you should anyway. As, first of all, are there anything else? Are there any other restrictions we need to worry about during this period?
So the other point that the FAA went to make in their policy is that pilots can still not fly if there is a deficiency. In other words, let's say you have a medical certificate and something has happened since then that would render you unsafe to fly. Maybe it's a temporary condition like a cold or even COVID-19, or maybe it's something more substantial. You've had a stroke or some other condition. If your condition is something that would not allow you to get medically certified, then you should not be flying in that condition.
Okay, so that's interesting as far as and those restrictions are concerned. But there's other restrictions outside the FAA, and one of the things that we talked about in the past and is insurance. How are the insurance policies going to be affected by this?
Right. So for myself and a number of attorneys, this was one of our first concerns, is that the many of the policies for pilots or for aircraft owners specify that the pilot in command will have a current medical certificate or otherwise be medically qualified. That was initially a problem. I'm getting reports now that a lot of insurance companies are allowing their policy holders to operate under this exemption and with that time frame. But if I owned a plane and wanted to go fly, or if I had an expired medical and I was going to fly somebody else's plane, I would want to make sure that that insurance company has signed off, preferably in writing, that they find that acceptable to fly without that. Because otherwise, you could lose coverage on an aircraft, and that's a very expensive situation to be in.
So really, the simple thing to do is just call your insurance agent.
Right. Call the insurance agent, they'll call the underwriter and say, hey, is this covered? See if you can at least get an email to that effect. Because if something happens, let's say you're in a tail dragger and you have a ground loop, it may not have been caused by the medical condition, but you don't want to lose coverage on that or have the insurance company claim that maybe that was a factor.
So with that said, there's another part of this too, is that how about liability? I mean, there's, one of the things we worry about, obviously, when have our own airplane is liability, whether I'm flying without this, without a medical. FAA is going to let me, my insurance company. I guess this might be a question for your insurance company.
Yeah, I think that would mostly be a question for insurance. This question came up in the last 48 hours with some other attorneys. And what they're concerned with is that if you were to have an accident, and hopefully that would never happen, but if it did, and somebody else was injured, either in the aircraft or on the ground, they might try to argue that you weren't medically fit. And normally the medical certificate is one of the things we would use to show that you were medically fit. And if you're exceeding that time frame, you're going to lose the benefit of that. And now you're going to actually have to go pull your doctor records and all this other paperwork and depositions to try to prove that that wasn't the cause of the accident or the incident. So generally speaking, I'm going to try not to fly with an expired medical. Actually, mine's good till October, fortunately, so I've got a little time to work on.
Well, that's good. Lucky for you. Hopefully things will get more back to normal there. One of the great things about general aviation is the fact that we can still fly during this crisis, especially if we're current. There's other issues, obviously, with the aircraft and making sure that you have your annual done, et cetera. And amazingly enough, the mechanics are still busy. So I'm glad to see that, and that's going on. But this is a really important point as far as your FAA and your medical. Are there any other key points before we go that we need to look back or maybe summarize what's going on?
Yeah, so I think the key thing to remember, if you're a pilot and you're considering operating with a medical that's going to exceed its normal duration, in other words, a first class that's over 6 months or third class that's exceeded, say, the 5 years or whatever time frame is applicable to you, is first, if you can get a new medical, go ahead and do it. It takes the ambiguity out and it avoids all the liability insurance issues. Second thing is, if you can't do that, at least make sure that you're healthy when you're flying. If you're flying when you're sick or something else happens, that's going to make it much harder to prove that you should be flying. And if you're flying on a medication that would not otherwise be approved, that is still an enforceable action. The FAA can still take an action on that. So you certainly wouldn't want to do anything that would put you in that position. And finally, if you have any questions, reach out to myself or another aviation attorney and make sure you have all the information before you do something that may affect your certificate.
So as far as questions, of course, people can leave them in the comments below or go to Stuck My Cavcast and hit contact. Also, your website, where can they find you if they have a question that can be directed?
Sure. So I'm at the Law Offices of Robert Strumor, and our website, www.strumerlaw.com. And Carl, I think you can spell that out somewhere in the video, right?
Yeah, we'll have that out there, and then you'll see that in the video right now is Strumor Law, and go visit that. Also in the show notes, by the way, we'll have all those links, so you don't have to remember that. I'll have it up on the screen. So, hey, Chris, thanks so much for joining us here with Chris Pezalla, who's an aviation attorney and airline pilot at Strumor Law. And we really appreciate your stopping by to give us a little more color on this. And of course, we're going to get a lot of questions, so hopefully you'll come back again.
Certainly, anytime.
All right, thanks again. We've been talking with Chris Pezalla with Strumor Law, aviation attorney and airline pilot. Below in the show notes, don't forget, by the way, to subscribe and click on the bell so that you're notified each time we put one of these videos out there. This is a really important issue. If you do have questions, obviously the attorneys at the Strumor Law can help you out. You might want to talk to your aviation attorney, but this has been really something that I feel is important for us to understand, especially as this whole COVID-19 thing just plays out here. And I hope that you found this helpful. Please hit the like button if you did. Leave a comment or a question below in the show notes. And we really appreciate your listening. We'll talk to you on the next episode. This has been a Stuck Mic Avcast video, and safe flying out there.